Okay, so I'm going to talk to you this afternoon about the possibility that you might see other people's mental states. Of course, that's harder at the moment because we're all doing things by Zoom and Teams and all the rest of it. And that does make it, I think, harder to see each other's emotions. But nonetheless, we're going to give it a go, understanding how it's at least possible at the end of lockdown that we might be able to see other people's anger, for example, or their pain. So here's my thesis. My thesis is that we can perceive each other's emotions. Now, I think a really sensible thing to do when you're faced with a thesis like this is to try and work out what it would be for it to be false. But first, let me persuade you that it's at least got some kind of initial plausibility, right? Just, you know, the way we talk and so on. So here are my initial thoughts. Our knowledge of each other's emotions, like people's anger or their happiness, is quite often spontaneous. And by that, I just mean we quite often just find ourselves believing that someone is angry or that they're happy without having done any sort of conscious, laborious reasoning to get to that belief. And I suggest our knowledge is also what I call robust. So there's an awful lot of different things that people might be doing on occasions where you come correctly to believe that they're angry. But they might be screaming and shouting with red cheeks and all the rest of it. Or they might just sort of change the conversation, or, you know, look up at the sky in a sort of strange way, right? There's a lot of different things, a lot of different stimulation that you might get on occasions where you can tell that someone is angry. And I also suggest our knowledge is fine-grained. So we're actually quite hard to fool. When you watch a play or a film, you're happy to go along with the pretense, but it's actually very hard to get you to really believe that someone is genuinely angry or genuinely in pain or happy or whatever it is when they're not. We do find it, at least quite often, possible to see through the pretense, to see through the deception, and to work out, even when things look very similar to someone's being angry, that they're not really angry. Now compare that to our knowledge of objects' colours. Okay, our knowledge that a book is red is often spontaneous. We don't have to work it out in any way. And it's also something that can be very robust. The lighting can be hugely varied, and there might be fog and there might be shadows. Okay, but you can still tell that an object is red, even in, you know, the light of early dawn or dusk. And likewise, there are situations where you can tell apart red objects from non-red objects, even when the light that's coming towards your eyes is very similar, okay, just from the context. So we can perceive colours, and I suggest by analogy that we can also perceive each other's emotions. Moreover, just to try and sort of sweeten the pill a little bit, you know, other people's emotions are really important to us. They're really visceral to us, right? When someone's angry in front of you, it's not just a sort of interesting intellectual reflection on what's going on that the anger is around, right? You really feel it, you really see it. Well, that's the idea. Likewise with objects' colours. And emotions can be very salient to us, they're very important to us, and so on. So there are some initial reasons why you might think that we can think of this claim as being true, that we can perceive each other's emotions. But remember, I said that a sensible thing to do when you're faced with a thesis like this is to try and work out how it might be false. Right? What are the reasons why someone might want to reject a thesis like this? Well, there are a number of reasons, I think, and a number of ways of rejecting this thesis. So one thing you might do is you might think that you might reflect on the nature of emotions, and you might think that emotions are the kinds of things that are just imperceptible, right? Just by their very nature, okay, perhaps because they're internal or they're subjective, because they're qualitative feelings or whatever it is, you might think they're the kinds of things that are imperceptible. But you might also reject this thesis by reflecting on the nature of perception. So maybe it's nothing very special about emotions that makes them imperceptible. Maybe it's just a more general fact about the nature of perception, that perception can't really have scope over other people's emotions. So you might choose to, as a strategy, to push on the nature of emotions or to push on the nature of perception itself. And notice that denying this thesis might be the claim that we cannot, like, logically or conceptually perceive each other's emotions, right? That it's somehow impossible that we could do that. But we might also just deny that, in fact, we do perceive others' emotions. Maybe it's just a limitation of us as humans. Okay, so that's another way or another distinction that we can draw between ways of denying this thesis. Okay, so we might just think, look, as a matter of fact, we don't have the kind of sensory organs that we would need in order to perceive each other's emotions. So these ways in which the thesis might be false give us ways or different kinds of strategies for trying to defend the thesis. Okay, so think first about the claim that we can perceive each other's emotions. Well, that relies on it's at least being possible that we can perceive them. And moreover, you might think, if this claim is interesting, right, what we really want to know is whether we actually do perceive other people's emotions. So one thing you might do is to try and persuade me that we do, in fact, sometimes actually perceive other people's emotions. And of course, if that's possible, then we can rule out the impossibility of perceiving each other's emotional states. Okay, so if you could persuade someone of two, then you've automatically got one. But it's very hard to persuade someone of two. Okay, we might have those sort of initial reasons that we heard at the very beginning, but at the same time, I think there's plausible reasons to doubt it, even just on intuitive grounds. So it's not obvious that we're going to really make decisive headway with the strategy of first showing occasions where we perceive others' mental states and then showing that that implies that it must be possible for us. So the strategy I'm going to choose is just to focus on that first claim, okay, that it's perceivable in principle. An emotion is perceivable in principle, and I'm not really going to argue in any serious way that we do actually perceive them. But I take it that I've at least cleared some of the ground for you to think that that second claim is plausible as well. Now, given the strategies for thinking that the thesis was false on the previous slide, one strategy for trying to defend the truth of this claim would be to start by thinking about emotions, to claim that there's nothing particularly special about emotions, and thereby to show that they might be perceptible. And this is a very common strategy in defending this thesis. People argue for versions of behaviorism with regard to emotions, right, that somehow emotions are a matter of how you behave and the patterns of behaviors that you display. And people argue for what's called embodiment, the idea that emotions are partly or wholly matters of how your body is, right? Anger seems to have something to do with increased heart rate, changes in blood pressure, and so on. And if you can argue that that's all really emotions are, then it looks like they might be the kinds of things which are relatively easy to perceive. But the strategy I'm going to make use of goes the other way around. I'm going to argue that it's not obvious why there's anything so limited about the scope of perception, so that we would have to rule out the possibility of you being able to perceive someone's emotion. So that's the strategy. And the question I want you to reflect on is what exactly would need to be true if it were true that we could perceive each other's anger. Right? What would the world look like? What would perception be like if perception allowed you to perceive someone else's anger? And I'm going to say that there are sort of two different kinds of answer to that question. One answer would be that there are particular kinds of thing that you would need to be able to see. Okay, what would we need to perceive in order to perceive each other's anger? Well, maybe a state or a process itself, the kind of thing that would go on inside me, or that might reach out to my surface if embodiment or behaviorism were true, the kind of thing that is the anger, right, or realizes the anger in me. Okay, so that's one thing you might think I would need to be able to see in order to see someone's anger. But another possibility is that I just need to be able to see a particular kind of feature. Okay, not the kind of state or process that goes on inside someone, but the kind of state that someone might be in. Right? They're being angry or they're being elated, rather than the kinds of machinery and chemical changes or changes in felt quality that would be going on inside them, in virtue of which they would count as being angry. So those are the two things that we might need to do in order to see that someone is angry. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to first imagine that we needed to see particular things, right, these kinds of angry states. And I'm going to say that that actually wouldn't work. It wouldn't help us to understand how it was possible to perceive anger. That pushes me towards thinking that all we need to do is to perceive particular kinds of feature. And it turns out that that is possible, or at least it's hard to rule out. So, what would it be to perceive a particular emotional thing? Well, what is it to perceive things? Look, you can perceive this car, this tree, right? You might be able to perceive particular events like this peloton, right? Or this particular crash. These are things that you might see. Notice that they're also things that my cat might be able to see. So the problem is going to be this. Right? Imagine that we had to perceive particular emotional things in order for it to be true that we perceived anger. Well, it certainly seems to be right to say that emotions aren't the kinds of things that we can perceive. Okay, or at least it seems plausible. But imagine that we could perceive the thing which was someone's emotion. We wouldn't actually have explained how we could know by looking, how we could come to form our belief that someone was in pain or angry or whatever it was. So I argue perceiving emotional things wasn't the thing that we needed, right? That wasn't the thing that needed to be true in order for it to be true that we could perceive people's anger. So let's focus on that. Right? It seems plausible that emotions are not the kinds of things that we can perceive. Right? Perhaps emotions are phenomenological fields, perhaps they're cognitive states or events, perhaps they're even physiological processes, changes in hormone levels, and so on. But whether or not they're phenomenological or physiological, right, they're either going to be not physical or they're going to be actually physically hidden underneath your skull or your skin. So either way, right, the kinds of things that realize anger, phenomenological fields, physiological processes, cognitive states and events, are not the kinds of things that in general reflect light. Okay, so how would you see that someone was angry? Surely that anger would have to reflect light. That's the thought. But look, imagine a situation in which you could perceive emotional things. Okay, that you might think that that's quite hard to do, but here to help us is this wonderful Martian from Mars Attacks. And the wonderful thing about this Martian is that this Martian's anger is visible. Okay, this Martian's anger is a physical process, and it's a process whereby their brow lights up with these particular colors. Okay, so it changes color, and that just is their anger or their being angry. All right, just imagine that that's true. Okay, so now you can see someone's anger. You can see this Martian's anger. There it is. Okay, it's that particular flush of different colors on their forehead. That's the angry brain process. It reflects light. It changes the way in which light hits your retina. But I take it, it's perfectly possible for you to be able to see that and to be none the wiser that this alien is angry. Indeed, the whole joke of Mars Attacks is that everyone keeps imagining that they can make make friends with these Martians, even though it's obvious to the viewer that these Martians are not here to negotiate. So, what are the phenomena that we're trying to explain here by saying that we might perceive people's anger? Well, it's something like saying that we're sensitive to it, or that we're responsive to anger, that we can discriminate it, that we can tell when others are angry and when they're not. Okay, but merely having their anger reflect light into your eye is not sufficient for being sensitive to or being able to respond or discriminate or tell when someone is angry. Okay, because you can see that object, right, that event of their anger without identifying it as anger, right, without, in other words, seeing the aliens being angry, without seeing that feature of them. So, perceiving emotional things, perceiving the angry state, was not what we needed to do. That wasn't the right target. Instead, what we need to realize is that perceiving another's anger is perceiving a feature or a property instance of them. Okay, perceiving their being angry, perceiving their angriness itself. So have a look at this person. Right? This person has lots of interesting properties. One property is that they're bald. One property is that they have a goatee. Another property is that they're angry. And if you can see that property rather than the physiological or phenomenological processes which realize that anger, then you've done what you needed to be said to perceive their anger. That's my thought. So, at this point, I think there are going to be a number of different possible objections. Notice that you might think baldness or goatiness reflect light, but angriness doesn't reflect light. Okay, so we've still got that worry that angriness just isn't the right kind of thing, right? It's not the right kind of property. So we were worried that the state of anger wasn't the right kind of state or event because it was hidden underneath the skin. We might have a similar worry that angriness as a property or a feature is not the right kind of property or feature to be perceived. Similarly, we might think that to perceive someone's being angry, you would have to perceive some angry goings on, okay, that it might not be a sufficient condition of telling that that Martian is angry, merely that their anger reflects light into your retina. But maybe it's a necessary condition, okay, maybe you need to do that and also some other things in order to perceive the alien's anger. Likewise, or So a further objection that's often raised is that, of course, we do make mistakes about when people are angry, and people are quite often worried that those kinds of mistakes are the kinds of mistakes that make it seem as if anger is imperceptible. So what I'm going to do now in the remainder of this talk is I'm just going to argue that none of these objections works. Okay, so it's true that angriness as a property or a feature does not reflect light, but it's not relevant, I will say. It's false that a necessary condition of perceiving some feature is perceiving the processes or the states in virtue of which the object has that feature. And even though you can and do make mistakes as to whether someone is angry, this is not relevant as to whether you can really see their anger. So let's think about each of these in turn. Well, it seems pretty obvious that angriness as a feature or property does not reflect light. Okay, but by analogy, it also seems pretty obvious that redness as a feature or property of objects does not itself reflect light. Even though redness itself doesn't seem to reflect light, we can still see redness, we can see things being red, and so we can see features even if they don't reflect light. So from the fact that angriness doesn't reflect light, it doesn't follow that we cannot see angriness. So think about the red book. That book is red. The book does indeed reflect light. We definitely want to say that the book reflects the light that it does because it's red, in virtue of the fact that it's red. But the redness of the book doesn't sound like the right kind of thing to reflect light. It's objects, it's things that reflect light. And the ways they reflect light might be because of the properties that they have, but the properties that they have don't themselves need to reflect light. So we can see the redness of the book, even though the redness itself as a property or feature of this book isn't the right kind of thing to reflect light. By analogy then, this man is angry. His angriness doesn't, we've agreed, reflect light, but he does reflect light. Right? And the light that he's reflecting is light that is reflected in that way because he's angry. Right? If he had been chilling out, he would have been drinking a cup of tea, the light would have been bouncing off him in very different ways. And so just like the book would have been reflecting different light if it hadn't have been red, this chap would have been reflecting light differently if he hadn't have been angry. So angriness doesn't reflect light, but I suggest that's just irrelevant as to whether we can see the feature or the property of being angry. Now remember my second potential objection. You might think that to perceive someone's being angry, you would have to perceive the angry processes and states. Now I've shown that that's not sufficient for being able to see someone's anger in any interesting sense, but you might still think that it's necessary. And you might think that anger is just not the right kind of thing to be perceived in that way. So in order to sort of back that up, think about the goatee case, right? You see the feature that this person has of having a goatee, but presumably part of being able to do that is seeing the goatee itself, right? It's not sufficient because my cat can see the goatee without realizing that this man has a goatee, okay? It's there, visible on his face. There's no reason why my cat can't see it. She's not blind, right? It looks like, even though it's not sufficient, it might be a necessary condition of seeing the goateeness, seeing his having a goatee, that you see the thing itself. So it's possible to see his goatee without seeing his having a goatee, right? That feature of him. Perhaps my cat can do that. But you might think, without seeing his goatee, you couldn't see his having a goatee. So it's a necessary condition of seeing the feature that you see the thing. Now, I've argued that we don't see the thing, which is the anger, okay, because that's something which, whether or not it's phenomenological or physiological or cognitive, is something which is hidden, right? Either hidden because it's not physical at all, or hidden because it's underneath your skin. However, not all properties are like goatiness, okay? And we should think about colours again and think about redness. Here's the red book. The book is red in virtue of some kind of surface microstructure, right? Some facts about the surface that affect how light is absorbed and reflected. Okay, just as this man, it's true of him that he has a goatee in virtue of those hairs growing out of particular parts of his face. But look, you could see the hairs growing out of that man's face, and maybe that was necessary in order for you to be said to see his having a goatee. But you cannot see the things in virtue of which the book is red. You cannot see the surface microstructures of the book, but those are the things in virtue of which the book counts as being red. So it's not true for all properties, at least, that seeing the property involves seeing the stuff in virtue of which the object has that property. The third objection that I said I'd consider was the possibility of making mistakes. Now, we know that this is possible. Okay, we know that it's possible, as it were, in both directions. Right. It might be that someone that you're looking at is angry, but they're hiding that anger really well, and you fail to spot their anger. Or indeed, they're just turned the wrong way, or it's too dark, or whatever. Right. For one or another reason, people can be angry, you can be looking at them, but you can fail to spot that they're angry. And in the other direction, right, it's possible to think that someone is angry, to genuinely judge that they are, even when they're not, just to make a mistake. Right? They might be acting and acting really well. They might just be pursing their brow in concentration, and somehow that makes you think that they're angry. So we can definitely make mistakes with anger. But of course, look, something you're looking at can be red, yet not visibly so, okay, because it might be too dark, because it might be cunningly lit, right, for nefarious purposes with a green light that makes it look sort of muddy brown. One way or another, things can be red. You can be looking at them, but you can fail to spot that they're red. You might also judge that something is red, even when it's not. Right? So think of the cunning illumination example. Right? There might be a white object cunningly illuminated with a red light, okay, for nefarious purposes to make you think that this object is red. Now, there is some analogy then between the mistakes that you can make with regard to people's anger, the mistakes you can make with regard to redness. And I take it, and I'm just assuming this, that we can perceive redness. So far we haven't seen any reason to deny that you can perceive anger. Right? In general, it's too high a threshold on knowledge that you never make mistakes. That just leaves almost nothing, perhaps even actually nothing, as something you can really know. But look, I think actually there is a distinction here. So even though there's some analogy, there is an important disanalogy. Think about redness as a property. Redness as a property is what people call an observational property. Now, an observational property is one where, look, if the perceptual conditions are good, there's no nefarious lighting, okay, and your perceptual apparatus is functioning normally, right, your eyes are working, okay, then if you do judge that the object is red, it's going to follow that it is red. That seems true of redness. Redness does look like an observational property. But anger certainly doesn't. Right. Perceptual conditions can be good, right? Good light, everything working in your perceptual apparatus, and you can judge that someone is angry even when they're not. Right? Maybe they're really good actors. Maybe you've just sort of identified the look of serious concentration. The question is what this disanalogy really does for us. Okay, the disanalogy means that emotional features are not observational features, so they're not like redness. And so if you could only perceive observational features, then we wouldn't be able to perceive others' emotions. Now, the cool thing about observationality is that it guarantees you 100% reliability in ideal perceptual conditions. That's interesting. That's quite cool. But look, you can see observational features like colours in far less than ideal conditions. And indeed, the whole perceptual system is geared, must be geared, presumably, to be able, right, with the teleological end of getting you hooked up to features of your world in less than ideal conditions. But so if you can see a feature in less than ideal conditions, then in those conditions, the question of whether that feature is observational just doesn't look like it's relevant. I mean, it's not relevant that were perceptual conditions ideal, there was no way that you would have been able to go wrong. Right? The fact is, perceptual conditions are not ideal, as they very rarely are in the real world. And nonetheless, you haven't gone wrong. That's how things normally are. So what matters, I suggest, is not whether the property itself is observational. Well, that's interesting in some contexts, but it's whether we're reliable. Okay. If it's reliability that's the key, then there's no reason yet to think that only observational features are perceptible. And moreover, I suggest we are in fact quite reliable judges of others' emotions. One way to spot that is that we're really quite good at telling when someone's faking, when someone's pretending to be angry rather than genuinely angry. Moreover, though, remember, we quite often just withhold judgment. Right? So we're quite often in a situation where we're genuinely unsure whether someone is in a particular emotion, and those are cases where we haven't yet formed a belief. So it's not an unreliably formed belief, it's just a situation where we're withholding judgment. So, where have we got to? I've distinguished between perceiving things and perceiving features. I've tried to bring out that contrast to show you that the thing that we need to do is to perceive the feature of someone's being angry, and that we can do that even if we can't perceive the goings on in virtue of which they're angry. That all puts us in exactly the same situation that we're in with redness. I have accepted that there is a disanalogy between the property of redness and the property of being angry, but I've suggested that in itself that disanalogy is not relevant to whether something can be perceived. So far, there is no principled reason to deny that others' emotions are perceivable, at least in principle. And of course, that's not to say that we ever do perceive them. More might need to be done in order to show that. But nonetheless, I hope to have cleared away a lot of the ground, a lot of the debris, right? A lot of the suspected minds that lie between you and accepting the claim that we perceive anger. So I haven't yet argued for that second claim, but remember, some of those initial reasons that we had to take the thesis seriously. Our knowledge of others' emotions is often spontaneous, it's robust, it's fine-grained. It has those things in common with our knowledge of things, colours, things, shapes, things that we take to be perceivable. I argue elsewhere, and I'm very happy to talk about it in the question and answer session, that it's really hard, right? The more robust and fine-grained our ability, the harder it is to accept that our knowledge is going to be non-perceptual, right? That it's going to be inferential knowledge that we have. So, where does this leave us? Well, sometimes, okay, especially when we've left lockdown, I'm going to be able to just see that you're angry. Thank you very much.